Hello and welcome, dear viewer. Now, I am a pretty big Pokemon fan. Not crazy, but I've completed Emerald, Soul Silver and Fire Red. I played several games at least for a couple of hours, and I have consumed a decent amount of non-game content. And because I'm currently playing through Shield, I know I'm kind of late to the party, Pokemon's battle mechanics are on my mind all the time. If you watched any of my other videos, you know that I'm a computer science and math nerd, and so I wondered. Everyone knows all the basic stuff about Pokemon battles, like type effectiveness and critical hits, but rarely anyone really knows what's going on behind the scenes to compute an amount of damage and hit points. Which obvious and hidden parameters affect attacks, in which order and how strongly? How much luck is involved when inflicting damage, and where? How do the games determine if an attack hits, misses or crits? And what about the moves that use their own special mechanics? I'm going to try to answer all of these questions as best as I can in this video, in the following sections. First, I will discuss some general stuff to make sure everyone is on the same page. Then, we will start off with looking at what determines whether a move hits or misses. Afterwards, I will spend the main part of the video discussing the actual damage mechanics and calculations. Finally, I want to address several diverging mechanics, most importantly status effect damage, non-standard damage dealt by some moves, and generation-exclusive damage mechanics. I want this entire video to be as exhaustive as possible. For this reason,
I'm afraid we need to use math.
We are going in-depth with all the math in several places, so hang in tight. Also, I will use uncommented text to refer to generation-specific behavior or bugs. Speaking of generations, the only game and console I have on hand right now is Shield on Switch, so that is what the game footage for this video will be. Let's start with some basics. Damage is a fundamental mechanic in Pokemon battles. Every Pokemon knows up to 4 moves, which if they belong in the damaging category, inflict damage on the enemy Pokemon and reduce its HP. If a Pokemon's HP reaches 0, it faints and can no longer battle. So far, so simple. Before we start with the actual mechanics, let's just consider what can affect our calculations. I will call these battle variables because they depend on the state of the entire battle. Let's start off with the most obvious variables. Every Pokemon has its base stats that influence various parts of the formula, like attack, defense, speed, HP, etc. These are themselves calculated in a complicated manner involving base values, IVs, EVs, Pokemon nature, and more. I won't talk about that here, but remember that the number shown in the menu is the actual stat value used in the calculation. Additionally, a Pokemon's level plays a role in damage calculations as well. Every base stat, except for HP, can have in-battle stat modifiers. Additionally, the stat's accuracy and evasion only occur in battle and can be modified as well. Most commonly, the modifications are afflicted by special moves dealing no damage, and in-game text is shown where they change. Any stat modifier for any Pokemon can range from +6 to -6 inclusive. Stat modifiers are reset for a Pokemon that leaves a battle. Similarly to stat modifiers, status effects are a well-known part of Pokemon battles that can affect attack mechanics. We need to consider all usual ones like burn, sleep, paralysis, as well as all temporary and special status effects like confusion, infatuation, and identified. Continuing to the move properties, every move has a base power, determining its strength, and an accuracy, coming into play with the hit or miss calculations. You probably know that there are 2 types of offensive moves, and consequently 2 types of damage, physical and special. Physical moves use the standard attack and defense stats, while special moves use the special attack and special defense stat. There are some moves that use 2 stats from different categories, but they are exceptions. From now on, I will only refer to an attack and a defense stat, but remember that these are either the attack or special attack stat and the defense or the special defense stat, respectively, depending on what move is executed. Other than that, here is a list of commonly relevant variables. Affection, weather conditions, rain, sunlight, heavy rain, strong sunlight, electric ground, items, Pokemon abilities, previous moves, and health items, can all affect damage. Two important notes before we get into the math here. In several places, the game will round decimal values to the nearest integer. There are three main ways of rounding used in the games. Normal rounding is the rounding you learned in school and the method that most other computer programs use as well. All fractions up to, but not including, 0.5 or 1/2 are rounded down to the next integer, essentially discarding the decimal places. All fractions from 0.5 onwards are rounded up to the next integer. Flooring is another common method of rounding. It simply involves always rounding down to the next integer, effectively discarding any fractional part. And finally, there is something the community has dubbed poker rounding, a special quirk that has remained through the generations. It's basically normal rounding, with the exception that 0.5 is rounded down instead of up. This might not seem like a big deal, but remember that rounding is done on lots of occasions, so changing a small part of a rounding calculation can have a massive impact on the final damage output. Second, and this is again Game Freak being Game Freak, multipliers are handled very strangely across games. Imagine a multiplier that would cause a move to deal 1.5 times the damage. You might imagine that we could simply multiply the damage value from the previous step by 1.5 and use that new value in the next calculation step. But remember, Pokemon goes all the way back to Game Boy hardware, which didn't really have any way of dealing with decimal numbers fast, that is, with dedicated hardware. Integer math is all that the C80-like 8-bit processor could handle. For this reason, the method used to do multiplication by decimal values, up to present generations, involves multiplying by an integer, then integer dividing by another integer. In our example, you might multiply by 3 and then divide by 2, as 3 over 2 is 1.5 as well. But this is not what happens. Instead, the value is multiplied by 6,144 and then divided by 4,096. Plug that into calculator and you still get 1.5, but the reason why such large ratios are used is that 4,096 is a power of 2. I won't discuss the details, but in binary hardware, dividing by powers of 2 is really fast and accurate. As it turns out, all modifiers are computed in this way, always multiplying by a large number and dividing by 4,096. A final effect of these quirky multipliers is that most multiplier values are recurring values or ones with long decimal places. Most of the time, they were approximated to be as close as possible to a simple decimal ratio, such as 5,324 over 4,096, which is exactly 1.299804687.5, and approximates 1.3 as close as possible. I will always give these approximate numbers instead, as they best reflect the developer's intentions. To finish off this tangent, each time we apply a multiplier, rounding is done as well. Usually, it's poker rounding. Let's first look at how and when attacks miss. This is the simplest part of any damage calculation. Every move has an associated accuracy stat. The accuracy represents a percentage of how likely a move hits. A move accuracy of 50 means that the move hits 50% of the time, or about every second use. This will change when accuracy and evasion come into play. They are the only modifiable stats not visible outside of battle. A Pokemon's accuracy raises or lowers its ability to hit the enemy Pokemon, and a Pokemon's evasion raises or lowers its ability to not be hit by the enemy. By default, both of these stats are at 100, which means no change to the hit chance calculations. If a stat modifier for accuracy or evasion comes into effect, however, things change. This is the complete list for the percentages used for accuracy and evasion. On the top, the 13 different possible modification stages are listed, and on the left, the generations are listed. Note that accuracy and evasion stages are inverses of each other, meaning that a +3 accuracy modifier has the same percentage as a -3 evasion modifier. The only remaining question is now how to combine these stats. Move-based accuracy, accuracy of attacking Pokemon, evasion of defending Pokemon. You might think that it's just a matter of multiplying all of the probabilities, as is usual with combining probabilities. And that is the method used for Generation 1 and 2. This will be a recurring theme of Gen 1 and 2 being the odd ones out. From Generation 3 on, the modifier stages are first combined. The evasion modifier is subtracted from the accuracy modifier, and then the probability is extracted from the table and multiplied with the move accuracy. This means that a Pokemon with accuracy +1 attacking a Pokemon with evasion +1 will use the stat modifier 0 and a probability of 100%. In practice, this means that accuracy and evasion's effects are reduced in situations where both apply. You may know that many moves don't list any move accuracy. Such moves step outside of the hit chance calculations. These are most status moves that don't actually deal damage, as well as a couple of moves that are guaranteed to hit. Before we get to damage for real, let's discuss a couple of special cases that essentially lead to the same effect as a miss, i.e. dealing no damage. The most common way an attack can auto-miss is type ineffectiveness. Moves of certain types cannot deal damage against Pokemon of certain types. More specifically, this applies to all the attacker-defender combinations highlighted in this type chart. For example, Normal is ineffective against Ghost and Electric is ineffective against Ground. Note that technically this calculation is done towards the end of the damage calculations, but the games treat cases where the type modifier is 0 specially to display the "it's not effective" message. This can actually lead to glitches in Generation 1 and 2 where 0 damage from unrelated sources causes the "it's not effective" message. Weather conditions can have a similar effect as type ineffectiveness does. Heavy rain causes fire types attacks to always fail, while extremely harsh sunlight causes water type attacks to always fail. Additionally, Pokemon with an affection value above 150 will have a chance to evade enemy attacks, independent of normal hit-miss calculations. The exact probabilities for this aren't known for sure. And finally, as with everything we will be discussing today, items and abilities can always influence different parts of all battle-related logic. For example, the ability Flash Fire makes enemy fire-type attacks always miss, while increasing the Pokemon's fire-type attack power by 50% once. As should be obvious by now, damage calculation is very complicated, mainly because so many variables are involved. Therefore, we can split up the calculations into these discrete steps. First, some attacks don't have constant base power. Their base power depends on circumstances. Because almost every non-standard move involves unique calculations, this might take some time, but will cover a bunch of the different moves. The two speed-based moves, Gyro Ball and Electro Ball, calculate speed as a ratio between attacker and defender speed. Gyro Ball's base power is directly determined by this formula that increases the slower the attacking Pokemon is in comparison to the defending. The formula for Electro Ball works in the opposite way, but additionally uses this lookup table that determines the base power from the flawed speed ratio. Similarly, Heavy Slam and Heat Crash use the Pokemon's weight ratio to determine base power. Low Kick and Grass Knot's base power is directly determined by the Pokemon's weight. These are one of the rare instances where the weight property actually has an influence on battle mechanics. 6 moves use HP-based calculations. Eruption and Water Spout use a ratio between the Pokemon's current HP and the Pokemon's maximum HP, where a maximum of 150 base power is used at full health. Crush Grip and Ring Out are almost the same with 120 base power, except that they for some reason use an overly complicated rounding and division formula. Conversely, Flail and Reversal use a similar ratio that is used in conjunction with this table, where lower health means higher base power. Beat Up's base power depends solely on the attacking Pokemon's base attack stat, without any modifiers. Only 4 moves are friendship or affection based. Return and Frustration use essentially the same formula, but the inversion in Frustration's formula means that while Return's base power increases with happiness, Frustration's decreases. The 2 signature moves Pika Papao and Vivi Wally from the Let's Go games divide friendship by 2.5 and use that as their base power. Counter-based base power changes are probably among the most well-known base power changes. Fury Cut deals increasingly more damage the more often it has been used consecutively and successfully. Rollout and Ice Ball have a similar mechanic according to this formula, which doubles the base power of 30 every turn and doubles it additionally if the enemy Pokemon has used Defense Curl at least once. Echoed Voice uses this table, where the base power increases each turn that at least one Pokemon in your team used the move. Spit Up determines its base power depending on how often Stockpile, the accompanying non-damaging move, has been used. Rage increases the attacking Pokemon's attack stat, which has given it the impression of being counter-based similar to Fury Cutter, when in fact it is not. Metronome, the item, uses this table to affect the damage calculations at the very end, depending on how often the current move was used successfully and consecutively. 3 moves are based on Pokemon stat boosts. Stored Power and Power Trip deal more damage the more attack stat boosts the attacker has, and Punishment deals more damage the more defense stat boost the defender has. Trump Card derives its base power from the amount of PP left on the move after it was used. If you think I was done with custom base powers, that's not the case. Strap in, we're reaching the special cases, which will involve a lot of tables. 2 moves are item based. Natural Gift consumes a held berry and determines its base power and type by that berry. Rarer berries yield higher base power. Fling consumes the held item and computes its base power from the item as well. I won't show the table here, it's way too long and boring, but in general, items considered heavier cause a higher base power. The strongest is 130 for the Iron Ball and the weakest is 10 for all berries and most basic held items. Hidden Power has a constant base power like most moves, but uses the Pokemon's IV values to determine its type without any obvious pattern. Although IVs are constant, Hidden Power can still be considered a move with a random type per Pokemon. Speaking of random, 2 moves use randomness to determine base power. Magnitude generates a random number n from 0 to 100 inclusive and uses this table to determine the factor and magnitude name. The factor is then used in this formula. Present similarly generates a random number n between 0 inclusive and 80 exclusive and determines the base power with this chart. Triple Kick is special in that it hits 3 times, but calculates accuracy and base power separately for every hit. With every successful hit, the base power of the next increases. And finally, 14 moves have base powers depending on other battle variables such as status conditions and weather. While this list scrolls by, I want to note that for every base power calculation, there are additionally negligible checks and caps involved, and all moves must have a base power of at least 1. Now there should be a definite base power value that we can use. Next, base power modifiers are applied in order, and this is where I remind you of the modifier calculation methodology, which involves the weird multiplication and poke rounding. I am not going to go over the 31 different modifier categories with each of their subcategories, but the general gist is that most of the important environmental effects happen here, such as mud sport and water sport, and many items and abilities apply under a variety of conditions. It's interesting that many of these multipliers are 1.2 or 1.3 if above 1. All modifiers are chained together with a weird multiplication and normal rounding, and the final application to the base power is done with poke rounding. There's a similar story for attack and defense modifiers, so I'm going to go over them quickly. Of course, there's our attack base stat that we're using, and first we apply the attack stat modifier. This table is used for these calculations. Then, after that, we have a whole load of further item, ability and battle state modifications. There are weather effects here as well, like Solar Beam, which multiplies attack by 1.5 in sunny weather. Defense uses the same procedure. The defense stage table is the same, and there is another load of modifications coming from items, abilities and battle state. Both damage and attack cannot be 0 after these calculations and may be reset to 1 on every step. We're finally here. This is the part of the formula that I might have seen already, and arguably the most important part of the damage calculation. The base damage computed here is about 90% finished. I want to direct your attention to this little section, which shows us that the raw level of a Pokemon increases damage. Also, attack and defense essentially create a fraction, a ratio of offense and defense that scales the other values. But of course, we're not done yet. The final modifiers are very important as they happen after the base damage. The spread move modifier of 3/4 will come into play when multiple Pokemon are attacked by one move. The Mega Kangaskhan exclusive move Parental Bond will hit the second strike with 25% damage. Rain and sunlight effects are next. No surprises here. Water is boosted by rain, fire by sunlight, and inversely reduced. The next modifier is the critical hit modifier, and I want to come back to that later. All Pokemon deal more damage with moves that are of their own type, and this is handled by the same type attack bonus, or STAB for short. It is 1.5 if that is the case. If the attacker is burned, the burn modifier is set to 0.5 if the attack is physical. And now the one you have all been waiting for. The most obvious modifier after which I sort of named this video. Type effectiveness. You all know this giant chart. It tells you what type has what effectiveness against what other type. 1 is most common and represents normal effectiveness. 2 is super effective, marked in green. 0.5 or 1/2 is not very effective and marked red. And 0, as I discussed already, is ineffective, which makes the entire 2000 steps of calculations we did here obsolete. However, it is very important to remember that dual type matchups stack multiplicatively. So if an attack hits a dual type Pokemon, both effectiveness values from these tables are multiplied. For example, electric attack against dual water flying type Pokemon deals 4 times damage. And also, you probably expected this, there are some special cases. No Pokemon damage would be complete without the randomness, and it's here where the most important luck-based aspect of the damage calculations come into play. First, a random number from 0 to 15 is generated, which is then combined with the base damage in this way. This essentially means that the attack can deal 85% up to the full amount calculated by non-probabilistic parts. Of course, we use a different random factor for each strike of any sort of multi-hit move, but not for the damage dealt to different Pokemon by the same move. Now we are really almost done. Z moves do some quirky things in combinations with protecting moves, but I won't discuss them, this video is already long enough. Here we take screens into account, which do not stack. The multiplier is 0.5 for single battles and 0.667 for multi-battles, and remember that some screens only apply to one attack type. And finally, some items, abilities and attack properties really want to change damage at the last minute. I already touched on the metronome mechanics and its lookup table. Hey, that's it. We have covered all the basic mechanics of damage calculation, including the well-known formula itself. Of course, I did leave out a bunch of checks and edge cases that only apply to a particular item or move in a particular situation. My main source, which is in the description, will have all the bloody details. Critical hits are a common sight across RPGs, and they signal an unusually good attack which inflicts significantly more damage. In terms of Pokemon, we have 2 things to talk about here. First, how likely are critical hits and what influences that probability. Second, how do the damage calculations change with critical hits? For Generation 1, the calculations are pretty funky, so I want to discuss them separately. Critical hit chance is determined by a threshold value, T, between 0 and 255, where 0 means no critical hit ever and 255 means almost guaranteed critical hit. The actual random event is a number, chosen randomly between 0 and 255 inclusive, and it must be smaller than T to make the hit critical. The basic way of determining T is by halving the Pokemon's base speed value. This is a very famous property and commonly exploited in speedrunning and the likes. Focus energy and the item Dire Hit are supposed to double the chance, effectively multiplying the base speed by 2, but instead they divide it by 4, lowering the chance to 25% of the base probability. Finally, moves with high critical hit ratios do work correctly and multiply the base speed by 8, drastically increasing the probability. So what happens when a critical hit strikes? The level value used in damage calculations is doubled, meaning that the actual damage dealt is increased by 1.8 to 1.5 depending on the Pokemon's level. But additionally, all stat modifiers are ignored, and by all I mean all. Even the burn damage halving cannot affect you, but also beneficial stat modifiers like the attacker's attack increase and the defender's defense decrease are ignored as well. Well known to everyone who has tried hard challenges on Red or Blue, critical hits can actually deal significantly less damage in these games than a normal hit. The modern day mechanics that have been used since Gen 2 are very different. First of all, the probability is now independent of most battle variables and determined according to this chart. Now, battle stages are also possible for critical hits, although much simpler. These attack properties, items, abilities and other effects can change the stage of the critical hit modifier, but several effects from one category cannot be combined. The only exception is G-Max G-Strike, a Gen 8 move that can also stack with itself indefinitely. If a Pokemon has maximum friendship, all probabilities will be doubled. As is the case with almost all modifiers and mechanics, there are effects that guarantee critical hits or prevent them. Here, it's mostly attack properties, like a bunch of attacks that always hit critically. The critical hit damage increase is now a normal battle modifier that I already touched on with the damage formula. It is 2, meaning that damage is doubled, except from Gen 6 onwards, where the multiplier was reduced to 1.5. This coincides with the significantly raised critical hit probabilities. Improving from Gen 1, stat modifiers detrimental to damage are ignored, which are negative stat stages on the attacker, positive stat stages of the defender, and defense boosts from light screen, reflect, and the likes. Burn attack halving is no longer ignored. Apart from critical hits being guaranteed to hit harder than normal hits, the difference in damage may be very large if a lot of stat stages and other effects are involved. There are a lot of moves that hit multiple times, possibly determined by luck or other factors. Every hit has its damage calculated separately, which includes critical hit chances and the minimum 1 damage rule. Hit and miss chance, however, are computed for the entire attack at once, including type ineffectiveness. Speed and weight actually get their own set of modifiers from everywhere. While speed modifiers are needed every turn to determine the order that Pokemon move in, weight modifiers are only needed for the specific attacks that use it in their calculations. I mentioned Beat Up in the very beginning with base power calculations. This pretty weird move determines the number of times it hits according to how many Pokemon are in the party and neither fainted nor having a status condition. Then every hit executed calculates its base power from a separate Pokemon in the party, effectively making all the Pokemon attack in turns. And, of course, independent of all the calculations I just went through, there are a number of moves that deal damage in other custom ways, meaning that they skip damage calculations entirely. However, type effectiveness is still applied. The famous move Dragon Rage, the only Dragon type move in Gen 1, deals exactly 40 damage. Sonic Boom uses fixed damage as well, with 20 damage dealt. Several moves always deal as much damage as the other Pokemon has HP, what is known as a one-hit KO move. Similarly, a lot of moves depend on the attacker or defender HP. Super Fang and Nature's Madness deal half the enemy HP as damage, and Guardian of Alola deals 3/4 the enemy HP. Final Gambit uses the exact attacker HP as damage, while Endeavor deals damage equal to the difference between attacker and defender HP. 4 moves are counterattacks. Counter, Mirror Coat and Metal Burst all reflect the most recent damage taken this turn to the original attacker, but possibly only certain types of attacks. Bite sums up all damage taken in the last 2 rounds and uses that for its damage. Seismic Toss and Nightshade deal damage according to the attacker's level. The last special case here is interesting, Psywave. It is actually a random damage move, and the initial random number generated is between 0 and 100 inclusive. Then this formula is used, which involves the attacker level once again. You may have been overwhelmed by all of the modifiers and effects that come into every step of the calculation. I think the takeaway is not to know that this specific Pokemon ability will change this specific part of the calculation in this specific circumstance. If you are interested in the mechanics behind specific moves, held items and abilities, you can always look that up and remember the specifics if you need to. But the takeaway is this general procedure that is taken for all damage calculations. What has a large effect on the damage and what doesn't. We talked quite a bit about randomness in this video, so I quickly want to address what I mean by that. As it turns out, computers cannot actually do things randomly, because they always follow a program that has a 100% predictable behavior. We say it's deterministic. And this applies to randomness as well. What we call randomness is really pseudo-randomness, a program specifically designed to look like it's spitting out random numbers that are hard to predict. However, most random number generators, as these programs are called, are pretty predictable. Speedrunners and testers of Pokemon games abuse this to get specific events, whether likely or not, to happen. Before I finish, I just want to say that none of this information was discovered by myself. A huge thank you goes out to all the people that have reverse engineered games and created damage calculators, written articles on Bulbapedia and elsewhere. I will leave all sources I used for researching this video in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.